How many words does a city need to document its own slow, freezing erasure from the map? In the brutal winter of 1941, the answer was not found in the grand, sweeping declarations of military generals or the polished propaganda broadcasted over the radio. The true measure of the tragedy was meticulously recorded by a 16-year-old girl in a small, fading notebook. Her name was Lena Mukhina. While historians often focus on the staggering statistic of nearly 1 million civilian lives fading into the white, frozen expanse of the siege of Leningrad, the true weight of this historical catastrophe is found in the micro details. It is found in the slow, creeping realization that the doors of a vibrant metropolis have been quietly locked from the outside. If you are drawn to the hidden truths of the past, to the raw, unedited reality of those who were forgotten in the shadows of great conflicts, consider joining our community and subscribing to our channel as we unearth these forgotten diaries. Today, we are opening Lena's notebook. We are stepping back into a city that was swallowed by the cold to witness the agonizing transition from the innocence of youth to the dark, uncompromising mathematics of survival. In the late spring of 1941, Leningrad was the undisputed cultural heart of the Soviet Union. Through Lena Mukhina's early diary entries, we are introduced not to a desolate wasteland, but to a bustling landscape of wide avenues, grand theaters, and the shimmering waters of the Neva River. Her greatest anxieties were the universal, timeless concerns of any teenager: an upcoming physics exam, the quiet complexities of first loves, and the anticipation of summer holidays. Her handwriting from these months is steady, filled with the mundane and beautiful trivialities of a life looking forward to a long, bright future. The contrast between this radiant youth and the looming darkness is profoundly, deeply unsettling. The conflict did not crash into Leningrad with immediate, deafening explosions. Instead, it seeped in like a slow-moving fog. On June 22nd, the radios hummed with the news of the invasion, but for the civilians miles away from the front lines, the war was still an abstract concept, a distant storm that surely would pass before it reached their doorsteps. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the subtle atmospheric shifts began to reflect in Lena's pages. The changes were quiet at first. The rationing of certain luxury goods, the sudden, unexplained absence of familiar faces in the neighborhood, the way the adults began to look at the horizon with hollow, lingering stares. Lena writes about the sandbags appearing against the beautiful, historic facades and the anti-aircraft balloons floating like strange, gray ghosts in the summer sky. The normalcy was fracturing piece by piece, but the overarching belief in an impenetrable defense kept panic at bay. We must pause exactly here to examine a deeply haunting psychological phenomenon that echoes through the annals of wartime history. There is a terrifying dissonance between the confident rhetoric of leadership and the reality unfolding on the ground. The citizens of Leningrad were repeatedly assured that the enemy would never breach the city's perimeter. They were told to remain calm, to continue their work, to trust in the unbreakable shield of the state. Because of this carefully curated illusion of safety, millions of people made no attempt to leave while the railways were still open. They stayed in their homes, trusting the voices on the radio, entirely unaware that a ring of steel was quietly and methodically closing around them. By the time the citizens realized that the abstract war had arrived at their very doorsteps, the last train had already departed, and the exit routes had vanished into enemy hands. As September approached, the final supply lines were severed, and Lena's diary entries began to change their tone. The schoolgirl concerns evaporated, replaced by a singular, haunting realization. The summer was ending, and the longest, darkest winter in human history was about to begin. On September 8, 1941, the final land route out of Leningrad was severed by advancing forces. The Iron Circle was complete. The city, home to nearly 3 million souls, was suddenly transformed into a colossal, inescapable island. For Lena Mukhina, the realization did not come with the grand announcements of military defeat, but with the dark, heavy smoke that choked the city skies just days later. The Badaev warehouses, the central nervous system of Leningrad's food supply, were targeted and reduced to smoldering ruins. Thousands of tons of flour, sugar, and meat vanished into the air in a single, devastating blow. Survivors would later remember the surreal, tragic sight of melted sugar flowing through the streets like dark, sticky lava, a bitter foreshadowing of the profound deprivation to come. In the pages of Lena's diary, the flowing, expressive paragraphs of a teenage girl began to fracture. They were replaced by something much colder, the uncompromising mathematics of survival. Her entries became consumed by numbers and desperate calculations. The daily bread ration was reduced, then reduced again, eventually plummeting to a mere 125 grams for dependents like her. It is difficult to comprehend what that number truly represents until you imagine holding it in your hand, a dark, dense block barely larger than a bar of soap, expected to sustain a human life for 24 agonizing hours. We must pause here to consider a profound and deeply unsettling aspect of human nature when confronted with an enclosed abyss. We often operate under the comforting illusion that civilization and social order are permanent fixtures of the human condition. Yet the historical record of the Leningrad blockade demonstrates how rapidly the veneer of a modern society can dissolve when the fundamental fuel of existence is suddenly removed. The true terror of the Iron Circle was not just the physical containment of millions of people, it was the psychological confinement. When the exits are permanently sealed and the shelves are laid bare, the horizon of human ambition violently shrinks. It collapses from the grand span of a lifetime down to the agonizingly slow crawl of a single day. The mind is no longer free to dream of the future. It becomes entirely imprisoned by the hollow, echoing ache of the present. As September bled into a bitter, unseasonably cold October, this new reality settled over the city like frost. Lena's writing reflects a growing, terrifying isolation, not just from the outside world, but from the very essence of her former self. The vibrant avenues she once walked with classmates were now haunted by silent, shuffling figures, their eyes locked downward, constantly searching for anything that might offer a fraction of sustenance. The bustling metropolis had been silenced, replaced by the quiet, shuffling footsteps of the hungry, but the true test of Leningrad's spirit had barely begun. The cold was only just sharpening its teeth, and the actual ingredients of their daily bread were about to change from merely scarce to the completely unimaginable. By November 1941, the very concept of food in Leningrad had profoundly mutated. It was no longer a matter of nourishment or family gatherings around a warm hearth. It had become a grim mechanical process of merely delaying the inevitable. The lens of Lena Mukhina's diary narrows drastically during these weeks, pulling us down from the macro perspective of a besieged city into the agonizing reality of a shrinking room and an empty stomach. To understand the depth of this despair, one must understand the bread. The infamous 125 grams allocated to civilians was barely bread at all. As the genuine reserves turned to ash, the bakeries were forced to improvise with anything that could physically pass through a human digestive tract. Lena writes of dark, heavy loaves baked with sawdust, cellulose, cottonseed cake, and the literal dust swept from warehouse floors. When even this became fiercely scarce, the citizens of Leningrad turned their eyes to their own homes. Ordinary objects were suddenly viewed through the lens of extreme desperation. Leather belts and old briefcases were boiled for hours to extract a dark, foul-tasting glue. Carpenter's paste was consumed as soup. People meticulously scraped the dried adhesive from the back of their wallpaper, boiling it into a thin broth, just to trick their minds into feeling full for a few fleeting minutes. Through Lena's steady handwriting, we witness the terrifying, silent erosion of societal norms. Civilization, it turns out, requires a certain caloric intake to maintain. When you strip away those calories, the moral framework of a modern metropolis begins to fracture. She documents the subtle but devastating changes in the people around her. Neighbors who had shared tea and laughter just months prior now eyed each other with heavy, paranoid suspicion. Thefts of bread became the ultimate betrayal. To lose your ration card in the snow or have it taken from your pocket was a definitive sentence, a tragic fate from which there was no appeal. The physical degradation was mirrored by a chilling emotional numbing. The streets of Leningrad transformed into silent, frozen arenas. Lena notes how people moved like slow, fragile ghosts, bundled in endless layers of rags, pulling small wooden sleds behind them. If a person slipped and fell on the icy pavement, they were often left exactly where they lay. This profound indifference was not born of malice, but of a brutal biological mathematics. No one had the spare energy required to bend down, lift a stranger, and help them to their feet. To expend that physical effort meant risking your own ability to make it back to your freezing apartment. In the grip of the siege, empathy was rapidly becoming an unaffordable luxury. Yet as hunger hollowed out the population, an even more merciless enemy was tightening its grip. The temperature was dropping to historic lows, and the city's power grid was failing. The long, terrifying night of the siege was about to cast Leningrad into an absolute, freezing darkness. By the time the calendar turned from 1941 to 1942, Leningrad had plunged into an abyss that defied human comprehension. The winter of that year was one of the most brutal in recorded history, with temperatures plummeting to 30 degrees below zero. But the true terror was not just the biting frost, it was the absolute, suffocating darkness. The city's power stations, starved of coal, finally went quiet. The tram lines froze in their tracks, looking like metallic skeletons trapped in the ice. The streetlights remained dead. Millions of people were confined to pitch-black, freezing apartments, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, waiting for a dawn that seemed to bring no real light. In the dim, flickering glow of a makeshift oil lamp, Lena Mukhina documented this descent. Her apartment, once a haven of warmth and family laughter, had become an icebox. The interior walls were now coated in a thick, glittering layer of white frost. To survive, the citizens had to make heartbreaking choices. Lena writes of the agonizing process of dismantling her own home. Chairs, Cabinets and floorboards were chopped to pieces to feed small, smoky iron stoves. But the most devastating sacrifice was her library. To keep her hands from going numb, to preserve just enough dexterity to hold her pen and document her reality, Lena was forced to burn her favorite books, pages of classical literature, the very symbols of the vibrant culture Leningrad was known for, curled into ash just to provide a few fleeting minutes of warmth. It was a tragic, tangible metaphor for the siege itself, civilization being literally consumed merely to sustain biological existence. We must pause and examine a deeply unsettling threshold in human psychology that was crossed during these freezing months. When a society is subjected to sustained, unimaginable trauma, the human mind engages in a frightening form of adaptation. Earlier in the siege, the loss of a neighbor was a cause for immense communal mourning. But as the winter of silence dragged on, the tragedy of human loss became terrifyingly routine. Those who succumbed to the cold and exhaustion on the avenues were left exactly where they fell. The pristine, relentless snow quickly covered them, turning once loved individuals into anonymous mounds of ice. For the survivors shuffling past, these silent figures were no longer a source of shock or grief. They simply became part of the landscape. They became geographic markers on the agonizing daily march to the bakery. This absolute emotional numbing was not a loss of morality, but a brutal psychological defense mechanism to feel the true crushing weight of every single tragedy unfolding around them would have instantly shattered the minds of those trying to hold on. Yet, as Lena navigated this frozen wasteland, the true test of her resilience was still waiting in the shadows. The cold was no longer just claiming strangers on the streets. It was creeping under the door of her own apartment, slowly and silently, encircling the only people she had left in the world. By February of 1942, the siege had become an intimately personal tragedy for Lena Mukhina. The grand, horrific statistics of the city outside were finally distilled down to the freezing confines of her own apartment. The people she relied upon for warmth, for conversation, and for the very will to endure were systematically claimed by the cold and starvation. Her diary entries from this period strip away any remaining pretense of youthful hope. They become the raw, unfiltered record of an absolute, crushing isolation. She writes of the slow, agonizing decline of her aunt, her primary guardian, noting with chilling precision how the lack of food transformed a vibrant woman into a fragile, hollow shell. When the inevitable finally arrived, Lena was left entirely alone in an empty room, surrounded by frost-covered walls and the silence of the dead. Her writing transcends its initial purpose as a chronological record. The notebook transformed into her only surviving confidant, her last anchor to sanity. In the absolute quiet of the freezing nights, the sound of her pen scratching against the stained, yellowing pages was the only proof that she still existed. She recorded her dreams, which were no longer about boys or exams, but vivid, torturous hallucinations of warm bread and steaming soup. She documented the profound, physical pain of starvation, describing how hunger gnawed at her bones and hollowed out her spirit. Yet, amidst this overwhelming darkness, the diary also reveals a frightening, stubborn resilience. Lena was no longer the innocent schoolgirl from the previous summer. The siege had forged her into something hardened and fiercely pragmatic. She meticulously documented her daily caloric intake, calculated the exact distance she could afford to walk without collapsing and strategized how to barter her remaining possessions for mere crumbs. The empty room was a tomb, but through her writing, she refused to let it become her own. Her words were an act of profound defiance against the silence that was threatening to consume her. However, the human body can only endure so much defiance. As the spring of 1942 approached, Lena's physical strength was failing, and the entries in her notebook became increasingly erratic and brief. The Iron Circle had held Leningrad in its grip for nearly a year, and for Lena, the margin between survival and fading away entirely was becoming razor-thin. By the late spring of 1942, the agonizing grip of the winter finally began to loosen its hold on Leningrad, though the thaw brought its own grim revelations to the city streets. For Lena Mukhina, now completely alone and severely weakened by months of extreme deprivation, a fragile, terrifying window of opportunity suddenly appeared. It was the frantic, perilous evacuation route across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, a desperate corridor that would forever be known to history as the Road of Life. Yet, for those who actually crossed it, the name felt like a dark irony. It was less of a road and more of a fragile sheet of cracking ice, constantly under the shadow of enemy artillery and the terrifying whims of nature. We must pause one final time to examine the psychological weight of this departure. To leave Leningrad was not a moment of joyous liberation. For the survivors, the evacuation was heavily laced with a profound, suffocating survivor's guilt. To board one of those canvas-covered trucks meant leaving behind the frozen apartments where their families had taken their final breaths. It meant looking back at a skyline that had become a sprawling, silent graveyard. As the trucks ventured out onto the treacherous, groaning ice of Lake Ladoga, the passengers sat in absolute silence in the dark. They knew that if the ice gave way, or if an artillery shell struck the convoy, there would be no rescue. The freezing black waters below would simply claim them, erasing their existence just miles away from the city they had suffered so deeply to survive. Lena's diary entries from these final days in the city become sparse, fragmented, and hurried. The meticulous chronicler of the siege was finally too exhausted to document the details of her own rescue. Her notebook, which had absorbed the tears, the despair, and the impossible hunger of the past 900 days, abruptly goes silent in late May of 1942, just before she was scheduled to be evacuated over the lake. The abrupt end of the writing is perhaps the most haunting part of the entire artifact. The sudden blank pages leave us staring into the unknown, mirroring the immense uncertainty that every evacuee faced as they stepped off the ice and into a world they no longer recognized. Did Lena Mukhina make it across the fragile ice of Lake Ladoga? The historical archives confirm that she did. She survived the grueling journey and was relocated to the deep interior of the Soviet Union. She eventually returned to her beloved Leningrad years after the war had ended, living a remarkably quiet, unassuming life until she passed away in 1991. But the most striking detail of her post-war existence is a profound silence. For the rest of her life, Lena never spoke of the notebook. She never sought fame, never published her agonizing testimony, and never revealed to her friends the depths of the darkness she had documented. The diary was quietly deposited into the state archives, buried under mountains of bureaucratic paperwork, a silent ghost waiting for decades to be discovered and brought into the light. When we look back at the siege of Leningrad, It is far too easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the tragedy. Historians estimate that nearly 1 million civilians faded away into the freezing white landscape, a number so massive that it loses its human shape. But true history is not found in the rounded numbers of military reports. It is found in the trembling handwriting of a 16-year-old girl who watched her world freeze over. It is found in the tragic mathematics of 125 grams of sawdust bread. Lena's diary forces us to remember that every single one of those million souls had a name, a family, and a desperate, flickering will to endure. The ice of Leningrad may have melted long ago, but through the pages of a forgotten notebook, the true cost of human isolation remains permanently preserved. Thank you for walking through the shadows of history with us today. If you found yourself moved by Lena's untold reality, leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. We will be waiting for you in the next archive.